Get our recording going, and we are good. Hey everybody, this is Jeff Martin with Magic City Books here in Tulsa, Oklahoma. So thrilled to be teaming up with our friends at KWGS Public Radio Tulsa for this event tonight. I've had and the store has had a really long-standing partnership and relationship with all of the great folks who work at Public Radio Tulsa. I want to give a big shout out to Megan and Judith and Rich and Scott and all the folks over there for not just wanting to partner with us for this event, but also really putting a lot of effort into getting the word out and making sure all of you fine folks who are watching tonight knew about it and bought a ticket. And while we're on that topic, I want to say thank you to all of you for doing that. Everyone watching has a copy of this wonderful book that we'll be talking about tonight. And if you haven't had a chance to dive into it yet, you're going to be in for a treat. And it's also a great book club book. It's a good conversation starter. I think it's something that has a lot of meat there to kind of bounce back and forth with the friends in your life or family that you like to talk about books and current events and past events and everything under the sun with. So thank you all for watching. We have a lot of stuff coming up. I don't want to go through the whole list of all of our upcoming events, but I will encourage you to go to our website, magiccitybooks.com. You can see our full list. I will remind you that next week, on Tuesday, we are doing our first in-person event in like 800 years with Joy Harjo, our great U.S. Poet Laureate, who will be at All Souls Unitarian Church, and we have tickets available for that. I think they're going pretty quickly. It might even be close to gone at this point. So if you really want to come see that, which should be a pretty special, that'll be next week. And then on into the summer, and I hope that we'll be kind of easing our way back into, by fall, depending on kind of how things go, like a 50-50 virtual in-person setup, and then kind of slowly coming more out of that. But it's been a great tool to have in these strange times. I was thinking, imagine if this pandemic had happened 10 years ago, the tools we would not have had at hand to stay connected like we have now. So even though it's been a really rough time, I think there's a lot to be thankful for in the way of technology. So thank you all for joining. Tonight, we are going to be talking with our new good friend, Lisa Napoli, for her book, Susan, Linda, Nina, and COKIE, The Extraordinary Story of the Founding Mothers of NPR. As many of you know, because I'm sure all of you are avid listeners of public radio, that this is the 50th anniversary of the debut of All Things Considered, and there's been a lot of coverage about some of these anniversaries and these amazing women that were there at the helm and were really groundbreaking people, and not just NPR and public radio, but in national media as well, and really blazed trails for a lot of people. And Lisa has spent a lot of her time these past years researching, interviewing people, and talking about the history of this thing that we love so much. So we're going to be talking about this book with Lisa, but we also want you guys involved. So make sure if you have questions throughout the conversation, drop those into the Q&A here, and I'll pull some of those throughout the chat. So thank you again to our friends at Public Radio Tulsa. We're going to get going, and I want to say a big welcome and thank you to Lisa. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me. I'm so excited.
So I'm curious, you have been writing about media for a while. Your previous book, you obviously wrote a book about Ted Turner and his life and impact, which is nothing short of pretty huge on the news cycle that we deal with every day. And this is obviously a topic more generally that you're interested in, kind of how the history of media and how that's impacted us. Where did it become? How and when did that kind of become a focus of yours in your broader writing career, wanting to kind of deal with media generally?
Well, that's a great question. About 20 years ago, I was working for the New York Times at the start of the web. As the web was taking over the world, the webification of the universe, I was part of a very small team on a now obsolete effort called Cyber Times. And I had a front row seat in that job to technology and not only how it was changing the world, but how it was changing that media business. Years before that, I had started my career as an intern at CNN as a young kid in Brooklyn, New York, when CNN was just launching. It was 1981. And so the course of my career, I'm in my late 50s now, I have watched all of this unfold from the perspective of a journalist. And as I say, I've been writing about it as a subject, but also watching it impact the industry. So it's baked into me. And now at this age, I just find it fascinating. Maybe that's what happens to you when you get north of 55. You just love looking at history and how it all came to be, the world that you've inhabited all this time, how it unfolded.
And what I like about what you're doing and kind of this larger project that you've undertaken, is the way that we get so many, I think, biographies and some good, some bad about people like the Steve Jobses of the world, the Bill Gateses of the world, the Mark Zuckerbergs of the world, Jeff Bezos. But I think in some ways it's been interesting to read your work and kind of draw more of a line from history to now, as opposed to kind of just focusing on now. And it's like you said about Ted Turner, that 24-hour news cycle, which in some ways I still think we think of as kind of a 21st century. I think we think of that as more modern, but it's actually kind of the seeds of it have been with us now for over 40 years, and
Yes.
it's in some ways it's almost older than television, the history of television before it, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And
No.
yeah, so it's just interesting what you're doing there. But I want to jump into the book here real quickly. Obviously, these four women that are the title characters of your book are certainly not the only people that helped make NPR what it is and was. But how did you kind of decide to put your focus on them? Obviously, Cokie Roberts is no longer with us, so you didn't have access to her. But how did the book take form? Because was it like first the idea, or was it first the people? Where was that entry point?
No, that's a great question. So I had just finished the last book, Up All Night, about Ted Turner and the making of CNN, timed to the 40th anniversary of CNN in 2020. Terrible time to publish a book. Good time to be talking about the impact of media on our culture. And I had said to my editor, this was in mid to late 2019, that I really wanted to do a single person biography the next time instead of about an entity. And so Cokie Roberts had just passed away, and he knew that I had worked in public radio. I used to work at the public radio show Marketplace and worked at a local affiliate in Los Angeles. And he said, why don't you do a biography of Cokie? And I thought about it, but I was talking to some former colleagues, radio colleagues of mine, and they said, oh, you've got to write about the founding mothers. And I didn't know that phrase. I'd probably heard it, but I didn't realize that Linda, Nina, and Cokie were this triumvirate of friends. Of course, I knew all of their names. And then someone said, but you have to include Susan, because Susan was this cultural maven and she really put NPR on the map. And I knew it was all in the recesses of my brain, but I didn't really think about it. That's why, books are necessary, because they explain those things to people. So I started looking at it, and then I realized, wait, NPR, all things considered, is turning 50 in 2021. And my editor, anybody out there who knows about writing books, knows that usually nonfiction writers, unless you're Walter Isaacson, usually Doris Kearns Goodwin, you usually talk Nahisi Coates, who I think it was with you last night. Nobody can write a book without writing a proposal, which often takes years. But my editor said, I loved your last book. I'll buy that book from you without a proposal if you can get it done in the next year. And I didn't know, of course, at that point that a pandemic was coming. But thankfully, I went to a couple of research institutions where there were some papers that were necessary for this. But he loved the idea so much, he bought it. And, I was very fortunate during the pandemic to have a job, which many of us don't have all the time, writers, journalists. But also to have something that consumed me through the pandemic. And seeing, just to add a little bit more to the answer to your question, the women were amazing, and the birth of All Things Considered was amazing. But what I didn't realize as I set out was just how indelibly it sort of twinned with the feminists, the rise of second wave feminism in the 70s. So the birth of public broadcasting, these four women's particular situations, how did they get to be famous, and the rise of the women's movement, all at this combustible moment in time. It's a great story. I hope.
Yeah, that second wave feminism was such an interesting time period. I wasn't there for it, but I've read a lot about it. And it's obviously tied into that ERA period, talking about the Equal Rights Amendment. We're talking about Gloria Steinem, we're talking about Germaine Greer and all these amazing people. I just note for people who are watching, Public Radio Tulsa is operated out of the University of Tulsa. And in the 1970s, Jermaine Greer actually lived and worked in Tulsa and taught at the University of Tulsa, which I got to think there were some stories there. We can get into that later. If you know any, send us a note. But what do you think it was about that? Because it seems like, yeah, you kind of tap into that idea that we reach these moments where there's this kind of synergy, right? Where there's kind of like, I guess it's like generational, because I guess all these people are technically boomers, right? Or right on the cusp of boomer, they're kind of right there. And if you look at some of those leading voices in that period, they were kind of that either right at the cusp or right after that, boomer generation. But we don't see that now. Obviously feminism exists and has carried on before that period, has carried on after, but there was something about that moment that felt different. And it almost seems like it has not been replicated since then. Do you think it was because of the defeat of the ERA, or that it never passed, that it kind of just withered away and didn't, what was the reason for that moment?
I think everything in our culture was different 30, 40, 50, 60 years ago because of the media. I think that the way our culture reflects what's happening, how we reflect what's happening in our culture, is so indelibly intertwined with how it's voiced in the media. And in the 70s, there weren't that many places for these conversations to be had. And women weren't allowed, they really literally weren't allowed to hold the microphone, to present the news, to write the news. These four women couldn't get jobs. And so it was such an interesting moment in time that women were rising up and beginning to demand their due. It was getting weird coverage in the media. It was, if you go back and forensically look at the coverage in the mainstream media, and that was mostly what there was then, basically it was very dismissive, very sniffy, kind of, look at those women burning their bras and standing up for themselves. It was really very patronizing. And so these women emerged, these four women who I write about in this book emerged from that. And they weren't militant, they weren't activists, they weren't using the media to advance a Me Too movement the way we see today. It was just a different moment in time in our culture. But I really do think it has to do with the fact that we didn't have this oversaturated media environment that we live in right now. And along comes public broadcasting, created to give voice to the voiceless. It really was created with this high-minded ideal of, the world is becoming a couch filled with couch potatoes because of television, the rise of television. Radio was sort of a marginalized, they called it the hidden medium. President Johnson signs into law this Public Broadcasting Act, which was supposed to be just television, because television was the concern. Combating commercial television was the concern. A bunch of people, mostly guys at local affiliates, and there were small, tiny, scrappy stations affiliated with universities, rose up and said, you got to put radio in. And public radio was born out of this desire to be something different than screechy commercial media. And so that enabled the reflection of this rising voice of women.
Yeah, I mean, and, without that period, there's no Sesame Street without that. There's no NPR. All that was kind of born out of that Corporation for Public Broadcasting, all that. I'm curious, a lot of people will say, the only way media ever changes is when people start seeing themselves reflected, and so that's, obviously we're thinking more about a television visual format. You're seeing, are you seeing people of color as anchors? Are you seeing LGBTQ representation, or all that? But how different and how revolutionary was it for someone to turn on the radio and hear a female voice telling them the news?
Huge. It was huge. Basically, these women, when they started working, found that over time in the field, people would come up to them. They'd see them with microphones. They might see the mic flag that said NPR on it. And people would come up to them and say, we've never heard women talking about this before. The fan mail that Susan Stamberg got, anybody out there who remembers her from those earliest days in the 1970s when she was the first woman to host a nightly national newscast. And the fan mail she got was like the mash notes that any Hollywood celebrity would get. It was extraordinary. And she saved every last one of those pieces of mail. People would send her chicken soup if she sounded sick. They were so enamored of hearing these women, intelligent women, talking intelligently about subjects that people were just not hearing women, used to hearing women talk about in the mainstream media before. So it was a sensation, and it even surprised them. They knew that they were smart women. They knew they had been marginalized and had a hard time finding work, but they were blown away by the reaction of people to just the sound of a woman's voice saying something about politics or government or anything. It was just shocking.
Yeah. What, growing up, or when you were, when you were a young person, did NPR play a role in your life? Was it something that you paid attention to at all? Because it feels like to me, it's
Oops. I'm not sure if anyone else can hear. Oh, there you are. You
I'm
got
sorry.
stuck for a second.
I thought that NPR had started around, say, the New Deal. I thought that, and when you hear the name National Public Radio, you think like the Works Progress Administration. You think, but I would have been surprised to hear that it was like basically a 1970s creation.
Oh, there you go again. Can you hear me? Hello.
Yeah, I can.
Yeah. Okay. I lost you for a second. You froze for a second. I hope I didn't too, but hopefully it's not a problem here.
Yeah, I think we're good.
Okay. But so you're saying that and someone interviewed me for the book a few weeks ago, and she said, "Did you grow up with NPR in the back seat?" And I said, "Well, first of all, I grew up in Brooklyn, New York, and I was born in 1963, and my mother didn't drive. There was no back seat, and there was no NPR when I was a little kid being driven to school because there was no driving to school and there was no NPR. So I didn't grow up with them as a frame of reference, and we didn't listen. My father was a complete and total news junkie before anybody called it that, but we, because you couldn't really be that much of a news junkie in the 70s without reading a stack of newspapers and maybe listening to talk radio, which in New York City you could do since that existed. But basically the ecosystem was completely different. So by the time I started working in the 80s, I was aware of Susan Stamberg. And by then she was graduating on to weekend shows and all of that. But no, I didn't grow up as somebody younger than me might grow up with that as their sort of soundtrack of their childhood and their parents listening to it, and not at all. For me, it was just basically the curiosity of how did this major force become a major force. I love to peer behind and see how things, how do famous people become famous? I'm much more interested in their early years than after they're famous. It's not as interesting. So that's what drove it for me.
Did these four women think of themselves as a collective in any way?
They did. They completely knew that they were holding jobs that were unique. Women didn't waltz into jobs on the air or behind the scenes in the media, and so they knew that they had this responsibility to each other, to the network that they were helping to build, because after 1971, it was a very slow build. It didn't just out of the gate become NPR in all caps. And they also felt responsibility to other women and to others within their organization. They felt very maternalistic about, my editor, who's only 41, was sort of didn't want to use the word founding mothers because that sounded too paternalistic and judgmental and old. And I said, no, they called themselves the founding mothers. You can't say that they're the founding women of NPR because they don't call themselves that. They literally fixed people up at work. They advocated for the union and served in the unionization of NPR. They expressed themselves when someone got hired they didn't like, or congratulated whoever got hired and basically sat them down and told them what they wanted or needed. So they definitely did that together and as a force with each other. I mean, the friendship they have, really, some people can't believe it because it is a very cutthroat place, NPR, and many workplaces are, but that place in particular is, and that these women were this unit was just sort of extraordinary. They'd cover for each other if they needed it, backstop each other in all sorts of ways. It's an incredible thing, fantastic thing.
Um, Talk about the access you had to these women during the process of writing the book.
So it's important to say that this was an unauthorized book. It was unauthorized by NPR and it was unauthorized by the women. I wrote to the 3 living women before I started the project, or as I started the project, and I said, this is what I want to do. I felt like I was a fairly credible person, having written about Joan Kroc. This is my 4th book about a radio station I started in Bhutan, about Ted Turner and CNN. And frankly, I think it's, I study biography and memoir, and I'm a member of a number of groups that study it, and other colleagues. And the conversation about memoir versus biography, which is unauthorized, it's really important because the fact that it wasn't authorized meant that I tell things in this book that NPR doesn't want people to remember. They want to look forward. They don't want to look back at the financial crisis that I write about that almost did them in, or at some of the peccadillos of the women's resumes, or all of that. But the women initially Susan said, not going to talk to you. But Susan had left her papers to a research library in Maryland that's open to researchers like me. So I went and looked at them. Then I had the chance, subbing for a local radio show in Los Angeles, to interview her when she was about to get the star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame. And we invited her on as a guest. And she was so dazzled by how deep my research was, deeper than most broadcasters ever have time to invest, because most broadcasters don't have that much time to invest. So basically, she was so pleased by that she did agree to talk with me. Nina, would answer calls when I fact checked. But the other trick in biography is, if I did a biography of you and I interviewed you about your, I don't know, childhood, say, your recollections of your childhood now are going to be filtered through years of stuff, versus if I'd interviewed you or took a record of you when you were 5. That's a bad example because kids are a whole other order of it. But so I went back and I mined archives and read thousands of newspaper and magazine articles and listened to all sorts of interviews that the women have given over the decades, listen to their work and see how their work evolved. And that really helped me stitch together a portrait. And that way I could call up Nina and say, Nina, you were in grade, I think it was middle school, with Liza Minnelli in a school play. And she'd say, well, how did you know that? I mean, that might be something she might not include in her memoir, but it was an interesting data point to me, especially since I tie it to Liza. Anyway, it's too complicated, but to explain, it's in the book, but it was fun. It was fun to do that kind of forensic research and go back and jog their memories.
Yeah, and it's important to know that that's what, it's a work of journalism. It's not hagiography. We're not, and I think sometimes that can be tricky with the authorized biography.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And I will say this: if I went to school with Liza Minnelli, I would want that in my biography.
Exactly.
I think we all would. So, the other thing that's so fascinating about this is, you're writing about these founding mothers and, the late 1960s, early 1970s, and some of them are still at it, which is kind of crazy, 50 odd years later, and they're still doing it. And Nina Totenberg is, I think, as vital of a resource at NPR as anybody right now. And
Absolutely.
it's kind of unprecedented.
Well, yes. I mean, someone had asked me in the early publicity for the book, oh, radio isn't ageist. Well, I'm here to tell you that radio is ageist. Our entire society is ageist. And unfortunately, I think Linda Wertheimer was removed from her hosting chair because of ageism. They replaced her with much younger people. So Nina keeps going. Nina is a singular force. All the women were singular forces. COKIE was working up until weeks before she died, both on the air, on radio, and on television. But that's unique. That is not typical. But they all have ferocious passion for what they did and have done. And yeah, I think Nina has said, my father lived to 101. I'm going to keep working as long as they'll let me. And I think, Susan still contributes. They all just feel such passion for not just the medium itself and the medium they helped recreate in having worked at NPR early on, but also they just love storytelling and they just don't want to stop it.
I think one of the criticisms you hear often about the millennial generation or younger is that they don't have like a sense of history or don't understand like someone lived a life before them, which I think is not true. Because I think, you look at this younger generation of people now taking the seats at NPR, it seems to me like they're quite reverent for the history of the organization and they understand kind of who came before them. Talk about that and kind of the legacy and how it carries on with the current, generation of hosts and things.
Well, actually, I mean, I've heard from people who work at NPR who've told me they didn't know any of the stuff that I write about. So I'm glad that I wrote this book so that they understand. Same thing with the CNN book. I mean, there were a number of people from the early days of CNN who read my book and said, oh, I forgot that, or I didn't know that part of the story. So that's always, for me as a writer and a researcher, a thrill. So I don't know. I mean, I haven't done an exhaustive survey, and I think that there is this reverence this year about celebrating the past, but I think there's a lot of detail like this near financial collapse that people, that actually is a really interesting pivot point in NPR's history that a lot of younger folk who work there probably weren't aware of, nor again, it's hard for people to remember a time before NPR was this major force and that it was so scrappy at the start and that the network of stations around the country was so small and scrappy too, because stations were just ramping up and professionalizing because they were just before that tools of the universities to which they were licensed, and they were great tools, but they were different than what they became. And so I think for people to see, for people who work there and for people who enjoy listening to it, or even for people who hate listening to it, it's interesting to see how it came about and how it did incrementally grow. I mean, for instance, the idea that FM radio wasn't a force when public radio was created, and that happened slowly over the 70s, is interesting. And I'm sure that most people haven't who work there today don't realize that history.
Yeah, exactly. I want to remind folks that while we're watching, if you have questions for Lisa, please drop those into our Q&A and we'll try to pull some of those while we go along. I wonder what, you mentioned the fact that, you were able to kind of mine some things that people maybe wouldn't have been comfortable with if this was a more, authorized piece of work. What kind of feedback have you gotten, if any, from kind of the insiders at NPR? You mentioned that you said people had never heard it, but have you gotten any blowback from people saying, you're putting dirty laundry out there that doesn't need to be, or anything like that?
Well, the three women themselves agreed to help promote the book when it first came out. So they did several events with me, and I've got a couple more, industry stuff that I'm doing with a few of them in the coming weeks. And they were huge fans. So that was exciting. I mean, the biggest compliment is that Nina, I've heard, is, or she said, is going to write a book finally after years of refusing to write a book because she saw, or her husband saw, that this book came out and got some great attention. So I'm sure somebody said, well, why don't you write? Now it's time for you to write your book. If this person nobody knows has written a book and is getting attention. But the one curious place, and I've been very delighted at hearing from people I don't know who are always your best gauge, because your friends are supposed to like what you do. I don't expect them to read anything I write. I just want them to be, supportive. People I don't know have been writing and complimenting me. Judy Woodruff said terrific things about it on PBS NewsHour, but NPR itself has not covered the book. So it's just funny that affiliates have, lots of individual shows have, but nobody has said, oh, this is terrible that you talk about Frank Mankiewicz and this dark time. But it's curious to me that NPR didn't cover the book, but that's okay. As long as people read it, that's all. When you write a book, you're so thrilled to do events like this, but in the end, what you really want is for people to buy the book and read it, or even pass it along. Although it's always better to support Magic City Books and buy it too. So
yeah,
commercial.
I can't agree more. I have to chalk Judy Woodruff's, compliment up to the fact that she's from Tulsa. So it's just her manners.
Right, I forgot that. I didn't even realize.
So I'm curious, just to kind of talk about politics for a second, because I'm curious, it was never intended that way, but it certainly has become where NPR is seen very much on one side, not in terms of their coverage. I'm talking about perception, general political perception. If you kind of take the spectrum and you have NPR on one side of the spectrum, let's say you have Fox News on the other side of the spectrum, that certainly was not part of the mandate when the Corporation for Public Broadcasting was there. I'm curious, how do you think that happened? How did that kind of solidify? And also, do you think that there is consternation amongst the brass there about how that perception, because I also don't think it's necessarily true. I think it's very much down the line, most of the coverage, but do you think that is a problem for them at all?
It's hard for me to speak about them now because, I would hate to speak for the network or anybody there, but I do know.
Perception-wise, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I do know that historically, President Nixon was very angry once he came along and was really trying to kill public broadcasting. He tried pretty vociferously to excise public broadcasting when he was president. So he was also very anti free speech.
It was the only media he could control in any certain
right.
way.
Exactly. Right. Exactly. So, historically, those roots, to your question, how did it happen that it got this way? I think, I had this problem or question a lot when I was talking about the CNN book, which is all about the very early roots of CNN and how Ted Turner was an arch conservative, and that there was absolutely no point of view. If anybody remembers CNN in the first 15 years, it was only once Fox came along that CNN started tilting itself just because it had to keep up. MSNBC too, which came along around the same time that Fox did. So I think with NPR, people just, the complexity of the media ecosystem right now and this bad guy, good guy, take sides. I frankly can't consume most of it. I read The Economist now because I do find that all of them seem like they're trying not to be biased, even if they aren't technically biased the way a Fox News obviously is. So but speaking for the network, I would hate to say it, I know that there is a myth that the government funds NPR. It does not fund NPR. The money comes from member stations who get some of their money from the government, but much of it is from underwriting, aka ad sales. And it is a very complex organism and a complex system. And I give a nod to that a little bit in the book. I wrote about Joan Kroc, who gave this big gift, the biggest gift, I believe, still that was ever given.
I hear that name a lot on NPR.
Yeah, she was an amazing,
from the bequest of Joan Kroc. Yeah.
Right. When there was no more estate, and how she gave away the money and why she gave it to NPR is a fascinating story in itself, and how almost half of it was supposed to go to PBS, but didn't, because PBS didn't answer the call. whole other story, whole other book. But basically, to the question about how NPR deals with this accusation of bias, I mean, literally, the only thing I can really say for sure is that the money is not coming directly from the government. And that's, I think that it makes it an easy attack for people who are anti open-minded or liberal. They just,
Well, it's a good pivot for me to remind people to throw some money at our friends at Public Radio Tulsa. It's not fund drive time, but it kind of is always fund drive time. So throw a little extra cash their way and support them. I think I hear about some of that every time there's a fund drive, kind of reiterating to the listeners about that thing you just said, making sure people understand that how that breakdown happens. So it's important that we keep that going. We have a question that is about kind of some of the other people around that time. This question says, what about Margo Adler? And the question is, who are some of the other people that we might know that are kind of still around, that were kind of early days NPR folks, that have kind of stayed the test of time?
Leanne Hansen interviewed me at a bookstore event in Delaware a few weeks ago. Many of you may remember her. I talked with Bob Edwards a fair amount, or interacted with him a fair amount for this book. He's no longer active in public radio, of course. That was a big celebrated ending that was controversial, but he went on to satellite radio for a time. And I think he now might host a show at AARP radio. Who are other people? Margo Adler is deceased, sadly. She was a practicing witch, apparently.
Yeah, like a Wiccan priestess.
A Wiccan, yeah, Wiccan priestess. She was early. Renee Montagne was early on, and I mention her in passing in the book. The problem with the book title is, of course, it's a conceit. The four women, they didn't create NPR, but they put NPR on the map in the sense of their voices adding to the dialogue and making NPR something that was recognizable at a time when no one knew what NPR was. And none of them, well, Susan and Linda started at the very beginning, but Nina and COKIE, when they wound up getting jobs there later in the 70s, had no idea what NPR was. It wasn't like they were aspiring to go work there. They wanted jobs.
On public radio. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So other people, I'm struggling to come up with other people who might still be around. This is a very focused moment in time.
Yeah, that's okay. We can come back to that. I think I'm curious to know if you felt that through your research and looking at their lives, do you think they ever felt boxed in kind of with NPR? Obviously COKIE Roberts went on to do lots of television and things, but do you think that they all got to do everything they wanted to do?
They loved it. They loved the place, and the place loved them, and they had the freedom. I mean, COKIE had this incredible deal where when she got a job in television, which of course many NPR people have gone in and out of television. Oh, Scott Simon is one who early on and played a role during this big fiscal crisis way back when, and not a role in the sense that he was assigned to cover the fiscal crisis, but he's a stalwart, obviously, to this day. Lovely person, obviously. But yeah, so the women, when COKIE got this job on television, and I thought about Scott because he briefly left to go big time to TV decades ago, before NPR was this huge, well-funded, paid as competitive, great salaries that it does today. Basically, he left and went to television, but he came back because he just, preferred radio. And so COKIE, when she got this big deal job on David Brinkley as one of the first women commentators, political commentators, she on commercial television, she said, I'll take this job as long as you let me keep working for NPR. So they all enjoyed a rare, most people in journalism don't get to write their own ticket, but they all enjoyed really terrific and long careers there that allowed them to experiment. Linda didn't start out as an anchor. She started out as a director behind the scenes, and then became a consumer reporter, then became a congressional reporter, and wanted to become host and did. So Noah Adams, that's another name from the past. Yeah.
Well, I wonder, these four women all were very different also in a lot of ways. And I think you think about someone like Nina Totenberg, and I think of her very much as kind of like the way you imagine a straight down the middle journalist reporting the facts, talking about what happened. Susan Stamberg, though, in some ways was very much like an early example of what you might think of as like opinion. She very much had a personality of her own. It was not necessarily like an opinion journalist or like your prime time kind of people that you see on like the major networks now, but she certainly to me felt more like you understood her personal take on things. That's
Well,
different. Those are very different views on how to do journalism.
it's important to remember that when All Things Considered started, or to know, because most people don't know this, that when All Things Considered started and NPR was starting, All Things Considered being its first news offering, it wasn't clear if it was going to be a magazine show or a news show. And there was a division within the ranks, and the ranks were very small because there was just this one show, about which way it should go. Should it be hard news, breaking, Capitol Hill, Supreme Court, et cetera, explosions, war, or should it be riffing on the news cycle, which at that point wasn't like the news cycle is today. Now, of course, we all know that it went one direction, which was, reflective of the news cycle. But Susan was from the camp of the artistic cycle. She wanted it to be more of a long, ongoing conversation. The example I love to use is that when Jimmy Carter came on the scene in the 70s to run for president, she wasn't interested in talking about politics with him. She wanted to talk to his dentist because he had that famous broad grin.
Yeah.
And she thought that by talking to his dentist, she would get insights into his personality, which she did. She did that on the air, and that's what happened. But she had an offbeat take on the news. She would not have called herself a journalist back then. Whereas, yes, Nina was hard driving, deadline driven, always about getting the story, turning the story, which is why when she got the job at NPR, she took to it so well, because they needed a workhorse like her who was willing to go out and run around town and grab tape. And it was literally tape then cut with razors.
Right.
That was her world. She loved that. Whereas Susan was much more thinking of herself as a salon hostess, which is really what she was, as the host of All Things Considered.
Yeah, it's so much influenced I see like by the new journalism, right? The people who kind of the Joan Didions of the world who kind of became part of the story no matter what they were writing about. And Susan Stamberg for me always felt like she was in the story too, kind of.
Right, right,
Um,
right. And that today, like you say, would be more seen as a feature or a host of a show. That was unusual then. Then, the people who hosted those shows were sort of devoid of personality. They were reading the news to you in a very flat, non-judgmental way. It was just delivering the news on a platter. And Susan was more humane, and that was a very unusual sound.
yeah. I'm going to get to a couple questions before we wrap up. This is from Lori, one of our viewers, who says, did the women's relationship with their male peers change over the years, or were they always well respected? So what was the atmosphere and the sexual politics and dynamics like between the two genders at the earliest part, and did it kind of change quickly in that strange 70s second wave of feminism?
Well, it started in 1971. Susan was appointed the host in 1972. She started as a production assistant behind the scenes. And basically, the man who was finally anointed the regular producer of All Things Considered, because there wasn't one at the very beginning, took a look around and saw who was substituting. And when she substituted, he said, aha, that's what we need to sound like. That woman embodies what we are. And he got some pushback, even from management within NPR. You can't put a woman in that job. It had been a man in the job, and they got rid of him. And then there were men substituting, and they pushed them aside. And Susan, well, one of them, and Susan got the job as the co-host. So men supported her every step of the way. And they didn't tell her that station managers around the country were calling in and saying, who is this woman? Why do you have this woman from New York with this Jewish sounding nasal New York accent? They literally said that. Why do you have her hosting? And they said, the response was, because she's the best person for this job. So every step of the way, there were people who supported these women they had to get hired, and they got hired by men, each and every one of them. Um, and COKIE got hired despite her political pedigree, which were her parents were in Congress, because there was concern that that might be seen as a political hire, because of course her parents were both Democrats, and famous ones too. So every step of the way, they got support at a time when women were having a hard time getting jobs. But it's important to know that within NPR, there were people who were envious of the power that they had internally and externally. And one man deemed the area of the office where they sat the fallopian jungle. And he didn't mean it, obviously, that's not a compliment necessarily, but he didn't mean it in the most disparaging way. It was really biting in the sense of those women run this show, even though they're technically not in charge. So that sort of sums up, I think, the answer to that question. There's a lot of both going on.
Yeah.
Yeah.
This kind of a little bit redundant to the conversation we just had about kind of the perceived bias, but one of our viewers made a comment here, which I thought was really interesting, which was, the question was, why was public radio viewed as a liberal force in the 80s? And I think, of course, that kind of extends beyond, but it says, was it because of the prominence of women? And that's an interesting point, because in the 70s and 80s, there probably was no other media outlet that had as many women prominently featured as NPR did.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you did a line by line, and maybe somebody has analysis of every guest they had, you can actually go on C-SPAN and see a couple of days in the life of NPR and how they make the news. It's actually really interesting. And I mean, it's long, it takes time to watch. But what's interesting is they sit in those news meetings as, in the old days, this is how all journalism worked. You sit in the news meetings and you say, we need somebody from this side and we need somebody from that side. In those days, the sides were delineated in a different way than they are today. And the world was not nearly as polarized as it is today.
Well, and there was a rule, there was an actual media rule at the time, the Fairness Doctrine, the FCC Fairness Doctrine, which was killed at some point, right? Under, so there was more, right? What? Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Well, no, I mean, the Fairness Doctrine isn't why that's not really why. I mean, that was just good journalism. Good journalism was, we're going to have a Republican on, so we're going to have a Democrat on too. The whole idea there was, if you covered a political candidate, you couldn't only cover your political candidate, or the person you liked. That stemmed back. I mean, it didn't stem directly, but back in the day when there was only newspapers were politically oriented. A Democrat would run one newspaper, a Republican would read another. So yes, the Fairness Doctrine was dismantled, but that wasn't what guided news, unbiased news. What guided unbiased news was journalism ethics. And those ethics are completely different today. And the whole conversation about what journalism is completely different today. And that is in large part because cable news came along. And at first it was not polarizing because there was no competition. But just the idea that there was constant news changed the dialogue and changed what we considered acceptable on the air. So it's a complicated question. But in the 80s, I think part of it had to do, I mean, certainly when Nina broke the story about Justice Thomas and Anita Hill and the sexual allegations, she co-broke it. There was a newspaper reporter named Timothy Phelps who broke it at the same time as her for Newsday. It got branded as a liberal play, even though it wasn't about politics that that caused them to break the story. It was just an important story to tell that happened to be about a conservative nominee. So there were stories, those stories got them that rap.
So last question is this, we were talking at the very beginning about this kind of larger project of looking at the history of media. Do you plan to continue diving into these areas? Is that something you're going to keep going after as you write more books?
I think it's so important to have these conversations like we're having right now and that I'm writing about. And I hope one day to write about that period of time at the New York Times that was so interesting, and later at MSNBC. But yes, I definitely will keep looking at, I'm so fascinated by the impact of culture, of technology on every aspect of our culture, how we perceive ourselves and one another and the world around us. And technology is radio and Zoom and all this stuff. So
Yeah, yeah.
yes,
I
definitely.
think it's time. I'd love to read a book about, the internet and how it changed newspapers. That's a great thing. So I want to say again, thank you to our friends at KWGS Public Radio Tulsa for partnering with us. I want to say thank you to all of you for watching and for buying a copy of this wonderful book. I hope you enjoy reading it. I certainly did. And lastly, a huge thank you to Lisa for joining us and spending some time with us this evening.
My absolute pleasure. Thank you so much.
Take care, everybody. Stay safe. See you soon. Bye-bye.